This Choircast podcast is brought to you by Inking Christ, a theological approach to tattoos by Dr. Justin Scoggins. This book is an invitation to view tattoos not as marks of rebellion or mere decoration, but as sacred symbols that narrate the story of one's faith and life journey. Dr. Scoggins' aim is to inspire believers to embrace the artistry of tattoos as a legitimate and meaningful form of worship, reflecting the beauty and love of Christ in a unique and personal manner. Pick it up today on Amazon.
Welcome to the Unbelief Podcast, your journey, actually our journey together beyond inherited beliefs to a spirituality that works for you. I'm your host, Jeremy. I'm a deep skeptic, also a pastor. We can fix that later, right? No? You have reached another book club episode of the Unbelief Podcast. Now that we are in the new year, we are going to be in a new book, the book of Exodus. It is the perfect book to be looking at in the new year because it is the story of coming out of something difficult and going into something new that is also difficult, as it turns out. And something I think that is helpful maybe to note as we begin to look at the book of Exodus is really about the authorship and the historicity of this book. The author is supposedly Moses and really a historical Moses, an actual person that is Moses, is not really easy to prove. In fact, the academic consensus is that Moses is likely a character that is made up, that is based most likely on an actual person, and these events in the book of Exodus are also constructed most likely from stories of actual events, but this exact thing didn't happen anywhere close to the way it appears in this text. There's been a lot of attempts to align the book of Exodus with the histories of the Egyptians that we have, and really to no avail. Right, there's not a good and easy case to be made that you can find what we see in Exodus, this massive group of people, the plagues, the leaving of all of these people, really anywhere in the history of Egypt. And even as I say it, I know I can hear the comments. Like if I had posted this on a social media platform, and if you're listening to this on somewhere where you can comment on it, people saying, oh, if you don't believe that it actually happened, then what part of the Bible do you believe? And I don't think that that's a really helpful question or even discussion to be had, because this story has informed an entire movement, a huge group of people, a religion for millennia. Like multiple millennia. Probably this was written around the first millennia, like 1,000 years BCE. So really, we're talking 3,000 years. And so whether or not you can match this with the histories that we have of the Egyptian pharaohs, like it doesn't really matter because it is still important. Its importance doesn't rely on it having specifically happened exactly as it is. And in fact, this story is telling us much more than a history about some guy named Moses and some people who were slaves, right? This story is telling us about ourselves. And the reason it has informed a movement and a religion of people for 3 millennia is because the truth here is way deeper than whether or not any of this actually happened in this exact way. So it's really, for me, important to note that at the outset, just so that we can engage with this on its own terms and in the deepest way possible. We're going to start right here at the beginning in Exodus chapter 1. Exodus chapter 1, it talks about Joseph, and it's really picking up where the end of the book of Genesis happens. And so in order to kind of make it here into the first chapter of Exodus, we need to rewind just a second, give you the backstory. You know, we were talking about Abraham, and you've got Abraham, Isaac is his son, Jacob is his son. Jacob has a son called Joseph, and he had Joseph ends up being sold by his brothers into slavery and ends up in Egypt instead of the promised land. And it is a wild story when he's in Egypt. He starts at the very lowest level and works his way up all the way to being the right-hand person to the Pharaoh, right? He is in charge of all the Pharaoh's finances, of all the Pharaoh's business, all of the things. It is his job. That's where Joseph ends up. And there's a big famine. Ultimately, Joseph's family comes. It's this major, kind of dramatic, almost reality TV story where they come to get food, and Joseph is the person there. It's a wild story, but eventually his whole family ends up moving with him to Egypt. And as wonderful as it seems just on the surface for the Jewish people hearing the book of Genesis ending this way, knowing that Egypt was ultimately a place of oppression and real hard stuff for them, it's like a foreshadowing. Even though it feels like Genesis is ending on an upswing, if you're just knowing and reading Genesis, it's actually leading them down into one of the darkest times. And so that's how the people of Israel end up in Egypt. And so when we start here in Exodus, the people of Israel are in Egypt. It says, then Joseph died, this is verse 6, and all of his brothers and that whole generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong so that the land was filled with them. Now, if you remember us talking about Abraham and God promising Abraham over and over that Abraham was going to have a multitude of descendants, this is that promise being fulfilled. This is God's promise being fulfilled, except they're supposed to be having this fulfilled in the promised land, but because of some really horrible actions, selling their brother into slavery, the people of Israel are multiplying and growing exceedingly strong, not in the promised land, but in Egypt. And then the Pharaoh is introduced in verse 8. Now, this is one of those verses that you might read, and because you are not a person that reads a bunch of ancient texts or history or any of this Egyptian stuff, like you might think you don't just breeze past it, but it is a major deal. Pharaoh is introduced here. When Pharaoh is normally introduced, when a ruler like that is normally introduced in the ancient world in a text, it's like Pharaoh, the son of the morning star, the conqueror of 1,000 shores, blah, 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 blah. Then his names and names and names and names. Pharaoh of Egypt, right? Ruler of Egypt. But here, it's different. Verse 8 says, now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. That's it. That's the whole introduction of Pharaoh. No name, no title, just a new king who did not know Joseph. Yeah, it's like a a slap in the face, or maybe kind of somewhere between that and a backhanded compliment. This is like throwing shade at Pharaoh. And it ends with a really important phrase: who did not know Joseph. Now, in the sort of Hebrew language, in the language in which this was first written, there's a lot of words that have deeper implied meanings, and this word, when it's used of a king or of a person and saying they did not know that person, it's not just that enough time had passed for them to not remember that person's name, or that person's name not to have come up in their history lessons. No, it's different. And a nice place to actually see this in action is in the book of Jeremiah chapter 22. It's Jeremiah talking to a son of King Josiah. And in verse 15, it says, "Didn't your father eat and drink and still do what was just and right? And then it went well for him." Verse 16, "He defended the rights of the poor and needy. Then it went well. Isn't that what it means to know me, declares the Lord?" This is it. When it says to know me, this is the idea that to know someone, to use that phrase, to know the Lord, implies acting upon that knowledge. Right? It implies that because you know that person, or in this case, God, that you will act differently as a result of it. And so then to say that this Pharaoh did not know Joseph, it's implying not just that he didn't think about him, but that he was not going to act and fulfill any commitments or any relationships that have been between the previous Pharaoh and Joseph. No, he was going to act as if none of that happened. Joseph's not alive, right? But the idea is that this family, this people group that has grown up here, is actually the descendants of the sort of second in charge to a pharaoh. That's who these people are, and they have status. They have like a lineage to be proud of, and it says that this pharaoh did not know Joseph. This pharaoh is not going to honor these people. And we see it right in the next verse. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." So then it says they sent taskmasters and oppressed them with forced labor. And so there's this sort of question that arises at this point. Like, whom will Israel serve? Because as it turns out, the blessing of God keeping God's promises to the Jewish people, to Israel, God's keeping of God's promises to them is actually the exact thing that seems to be a sign of disaster for Pharaoh. And then the other thing that's really beautiful here is that Pharaoh is the first person in the text of the Bible to recognize Israel as a people, not just as a descendant or as an individual person or a family, but now they are something bigger. They are a race. They are a people group, right? And then the next verse, it's brilliant. After it talks about them being oppressed, being enslaved, building these cities, in verse 12, it says, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. And that little bit is incredibly powerful, right? The idea that that Pharaoh's kind of wisdom to himself and how he's going to deal with this is not wisdom. In fact, like the more they are oppressed, the more they grow, right? The more God's promises come to fruition. Like the idea that oppression will actually silence people, it's often a surprise to the oppressors that that's not what happens, right? What happens, and you can see it over and over again throughout history, people who are oppressed do not ultimately stay silent and submissive forever. And the more they are oppressed, the more the power and motivation for justice grows inside of them. The more they bond together because of the oppression, the more powerful and connected they get because of the oppression. Right? If the oppressors just kept getting lighter and lighter and lighter and lighter, when they resisted, they actually might not actually get very far. Right? Because what happens throughout history is somebody resists and then the oppressor doubles down and they resist stronger. And then the oppressor doubles down and they resist stronger. Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes that is what happens to us. That is our response to hard things. And I know that in my life, right? There's really two ways that I end up responding to hard times, right? I will either, in general, allow the hard things to silence me, to keep me down. I will slide maybe into depression. I will be overwhelmed by my anxiety. Or the hard time will help me grow. And really, when I say either or, I don't mean like it's a one situation is only one way. Because usually for me, I start in that initial mode of defeat and depression. And then at some point along the way, either everything gets better or I say, hang on, I can't let this keep me down forever. I have to get up. I have to do the next thing. And instead of having this ruin everything, I have to allow it to make me stronger. And it's going to hurt. It is going to be hard. But if I keep reminding myself when things get hard, oh, no, I'm trying to let this make me stronger. I'm trying to move in this other direction, a direction of more wholeness and peace and whatever, a new direction in my life and in this situation. If I keep reminding myself of that, I end up like the Israelites. I end up growing as a result of the oppression in my life, growing as a result of the hard things that are going on for me. the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that, and here it is, the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. So this is the thing. They double down. They make their lives bitter. And they have to make mortar and bricks and do every kind of labor. Pharaoh is ruthless in all the task they're imposing on the Israelites. Yeah. Pharaoh thinks he is gonna get ahead with this, but it turns out that he's not. And like all oppressors before and since, he just keeps doubling down on the oppression. Yeah. And this is sort of setting a stage in this story for us. And one of the big things that we see right here is that God is continuing to fulfill God's promises to make the people strong. Even in the midst of oppression, they still grow. They're still strong. And it's setting the stage for a big message, an overall orientation that is revealed about God in this story. And it's that God, when it comes to oppression, right, when it comes to injustice, God isn't neutral. God takes sides. And when God takes sides, when there is oppression, God is always on the side of the oppressed. God is always on the side of the victims of injustice. He's not on the side of the powerful. Even when the powerful are supposedly his chosen people, later in the Bible, you actually see in the Old Testament, there's a moment at which Israel begins to take slaves and use slave labor. And when that happens, when the oppressed becomes the oppressor, God is no longer on their side. God is always on the side of the oppressed. And this is a moment that's sort of setting the stage for us to see that about God in the future. But the first chapter keeps going and we get, oh my gosh, it gets wild. There is this wild and beautiful story here at the end of the first chapter that, I don't know, I love it because of how dramatic it is. So it says that the king of Egypt brings Hebrew midwives in, and he says to the midwives, so midwives, if you aren't familiar, they're people who help women have babies. So before there was OBGYN doctors, right? There are midwives who help women have babies. And so the king of Egypt says to the Hebrew midwives, and it has a little aside here. It says, one whom was named Shipra and the other Puah. This is beautiful because so far, the Pharaoh does not have a name, but two Hebrew midwives have names. The king of all of the people, the most powerful person, no name. These two midwife slaves. Yeah, they've got a name. Yeah. But what Pharaoh says to them, he says, when you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, kill it. But if it's a daughter, she shall live. So ultimately now, Pharaoh's response to God fulfilling God's promise, to God bringing much life, right? Just an abundance of life to the Israel, to to the Israelites, Pharaoh's response to that life is death. And this is a place where you see what we're just talking about, where you see the oppression and the injustice giving people strength, right? These two Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, are told to kill all the male babies. But it says, but the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them. This is incredible. I mean, the level of bravery, the level of strength in these two women, man, it's really impossible to overestimate that. These two Hebrew midwives, these two women are just blatantly disobeying the most powerful and clearly ruthless person in their world. You just don't do it. Which is good, right? Like this is what you're supposed to do, right? When somebody asks you to do something horrible and immoral, you just don't do it, right? And even if that person is in power, even if that person can do horrible things to you, when somebody tells you to do something horrifyingly immoral, you say no. And you take the consequences. There will likely be consequences, right? So they don't do it and let the boys live. And in verse 18, it says, so the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and allowed the boys to live? I love this moment. They just say, no, we're not going to do it. And then Pharaoh brings them back in and confronts them, says, what are you doing? Why is this? They're still living. I see little baby Hebrew boys running around. What's going on? And their response, oh my gosh, their response is so brave. It is so strong. They say, because Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They're vigorous and give birth before the midwives come to them. They are able to give an explanation while also insulting Egyptians. And like that, I'm sorry. They're just too strong. They're just having the babies before we even get there. These two women, Shiphrah and Puah. Oh man. Shiphrah and Puah are like standing up to Pharaoh in his face, right there in front of him. They're saying no. And the way they're doing it is really interesting, right? If you look at it, I mean, it's real clear. They are lying. They're just straight lying. There is no way to twist what they are saying to imply, to have any way of saying that that it is truthful. They are not telling the truth. And that's important. They're not telling the truth. And we are supposed to know lying is bad, right? There's even, it's one of the commandments, thou shalt not lie, right? But what if lying could save a bunch of baby boys? Huh. Like, is lying then immoral, unethical? Is it unethical or immoral to lie if by lying you will save a bunch of babies? Right? One small thing saving the lives of, like, I mean, I hope most people who are listening to this podcast would just tell the lie. But this is where, like, moral absolutism can go horribly wrong. Moral absolutes are just not as useful as you think. And really, in practice, so we have the scriptures in the Bible. We have a lot of records of how the Bible was used and interpreted by Sanhedrins and priests and all of that stuff. And these were not treated as absolutes. Not even the laws that have like punishments and that kind of, like, none of that was treated as absolutes. There was wisdom applied in every situation, right? And this is where, growing up in fundamentalist churches or evangelical churches, you might see, like, oh man, that was not helpful. That was not helpful. The moral absolutism is simple, but it's actually not ultimately helpful. And you end up, right, if lying is always an absolute sin, then are you supposed to feel guilty about telling a lie to save babies? Yeah, that doesn't seem right. Yeah. But if instead you see these statements, these things like the Ten Commandments as a way to orient yourself in the world and a way to live a more loving and just life, then instead of treating them as absolutes, if they're sort of a direction, then it helps you say, oh yeah, but I'm actually trying to live a just life. I'm trying to do the right and just thing. And in this situation, lying is actually the right and just thing. It's not an absolute, right? If telling the truth is going to take you off that course of justice and love, right? Then of course, like, you've got to lie in that situation, right? To save the babies. And it's not that you had to sin or do something bad, because the absolutism is really the problem there, right? And really, it's a problem in a lot of ways because it's treating the world at this level of comprehension that is, the very earliest parts of understanding morality, right? It's like you never progress beyond that. It's like children have this like absolute yes or no, black and white, right or wrong, very concrete understanding about morality. But then as they grow and go through puberty and their brains release the wonderful chemicals that allow them to understand metaphor and nuance, you begin to grow and understand that really the world is not black and white. The world is gray. Right. And everything requires interpretation and understanding, and not everything is much harder than you probably thought it was. Yeah. And that's what we see here. Shipra and Pua, they lie because that is the right and godly and holy thing to do in this moment. And so it says God rewards them. So this is another thing just to underscore that, right? Verse 21, and because the midwives fear God, he gave them families. This is a reward for God. And God's rewarding them for doing the right thing, for lying, and doing the right thing by lying. But God, because what they are doing, the effect of their actions is to do what God wants them to do, to be who God wants them to be. And then the chapter ends with this like cliffhanger ending, this sort of ominous, like, what is going to happen? The other thing that's really interesting here is that up until right here at the end, God isn't really mentioned, right? And it's a fascinating thing that God really comes in a little bit later in the story, not in the first little bit. It takes until the midwives stand up to Pharaoh that you start hearing about God. And the other thing that's happening here is that cunning is being celebrated. Being cunning is being celebrated. And this is actually something that you also see in lots of places, in lots of the different books in the library that is the Bible. It's that being cunning and sort of one of the phrases is wise as a serpent, harmless as a dove, right? This like cunningness that if you used in the wrong way, being cunning can be bad. But here and in many places in the Bible, we find cunning individuals celebrated for using their cunningness to do the right thing and bring good into the world. Yeah, that's the beginning of this Exodus story. We sort of begin in this state of freedom and quickly plunge down into oppression and slavery. And the end of this book, like where the book is headed, is there's going to be some consequences for the Pharaoh. There's going to be freedom for the people. And then things are going to get hard again, just in a new way. Yeah. So, which is, of course, the story of our life, right? Freedom, really deep, hard thing, coming out of that to something new and good and positive, only to find the new and good and positive thing is also very difficult, even though it might not be as bad and negative. Yeah. That's our life. And in that way, the way this story begins right in this chapter with freedom and then diving down into some of the hardest parts, recognizing that is the norm for life, and that this story is showing us how there is the presence of the divine in all of those places, the happy, wonderful, free places, the dark, horrible, depressed places, and sort of everywhere in between. That biggest message there, the sort of pattern of life, is so helpful to keep in mind, because a lot of times what we think our life is supposed to be about, is supposed to look like, is some sort of, if you plotted it on a line chart, with the higher being better life, the lower being the worst life, higher being closer to God on the chart, lower being away from God, whatever, high and low, but like those stereotypical high and low, positive and negative, right? As you move through the chart on, time on the other axis, you feel like the line should just be going up, on a diagonal angle up. And that's just not reality. Life doesn't look like that. No one's life ever looks like that. It's always a line chart with peaks and valleys and plateaus, and just, it looks way more like a roller coaster than some sort of straight line going right up to God and profitability, whatever. Now, that's not the way it works. It's not the way life is. And it's helpful to recognize that's actually the norm of life. The norm is the up and the downs, because when we see that, when we recognize that is what we should expect, we can deal with where we exist on that chart today because we don't have to just feel guilty that the chart doesn't look right, that it's not always up and to the right. You know what I'm saying? When you recognize that actually that's not a thing, that's not attainable, that's not the goal. Instead, we look at this roller coaster and try to figure out how to enjoy the peaks and the valleys, how to be grounded and a person of peace and love and justice wherever the chart is taking us at this given moment, right? That's powerful. That's really helpful as we try to navigate all of the hardness and wonderfulness of life. All of that in the first chapter of the book of Exodus. And man, I tell you, this is great because a lot of you ended 2024 at a level. You want to take 2025 in a better place, and that's going to be so good. But you might start 2025 going to the gym every day of the week only to have that freedom crash down into the floor a month later. But that's okay. That's okay, because we're going to come from where we are and chart a course into a more free and loving and just and connected place. We're going to do that together in this story on the next several weeks. I can't wait. Shipra Pua, amazing part of the story. But man, the next part, it blows my mind every single time. And hey, if you missed the big announcement, I am so excited at the beginning of this new year because I am now a full-time pastor to this digital community that we have here. I had a couple of people tell me that like what was happening here probably needed all of my attention. And so I went to the sort of denominational higher ups and I said, look, I've got all these people that are online that are not going to church, not interested in ever darkening. They have lots of religious trauma. Church is not, but they are wanting to engage with God or the divine or whatever. And many of them have literally asked me to be their pastor. I kind of feel like they deserve a pastor, just like everybody else, even if they're not going to go to church, even if they may or may not be okay with the whole Jesus thing. They deserve a pastor. And my leaders said, yeah, go do that. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm your pastor full time right now. And there's a bunch of ways that we can engage with each other. The easiest ways are not church Discord. It's kind of, we call it not church because somebody said it's like church. It's got all the things that you want, a community of people trying to process their own religious trauma, talk about spirituality and post really funny memes and being there when things are hard. Yeah. This is what that is, not church. And it's like church. It's got all those things, but nobody's yelling at you because you don't believe the right things. Nobody's telling you you're going to hell for that. Yeah. If you're interested in that, go to patreon.com/skepticpastor. And for $3 a month, you can get access to that. It's $3 because we're trying to pay for this stuff. But we're not going to ask you to give us like 10% of your income. It's pay for what you get. If it stops working for you, just stop paying, right? But the Not Church Discord, it's so wonderful and beautiful. I think you'd absolutely love it. We also have some fun merch on newmancommunity.com/store. And wherever you are listening to this podcast, if you could give us all the stars, write a review. Like when you say something in writing, man, that makes a huge difference in helping us spread the word. So yeah. Give us all the stars. Tell a friend that we exist. That's it. That's the podcast. Shout out to the Choir Network, to Patheos, to Matthew and Keith, who make everything happen. Now, get out of here. Go do something to make the world a better place. Okay? We'll see you next time.